Well, good evening, and welcome to the University of Washington's 31st Annual Faculty Lecture. I'm Mark Emmert, the president of the university, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this event tonight and to introduce this year's speaker. Tonight, our faculty speaker is John Taves, a professor of history and director of the program in the Comparative History of Ideas. In delivering this address, Professor Taves joins a distinguished group of University of Washington faculty. Selection for this lecture is perhaps the highest honor a faculty member can receive from his peers here at the university. John Taves has been chairman of the program on Comparative History of Ideas and its driving force since 1982. In 2000, the program was honored as the UW's Brotman Award winner for instructional excellence. CHID has also grown from a handful of students to the second largest unit in the UW Humanities after English majors. This past year, 265 majors enrolled in CHID and 103 majors graduated. Professor Taves is held in high esteem not only by his peers but also by his students and receives wonderful accolades from them. To quote one, "John is probably the most thorough, scholarly, brilliant teacher I've ever had. The thoroughness of his analysis never ceases to amaze me, and I'd simply love being one of his students," says Wendy Wiseman, who studied with Taves as an undergraduate and is teaching in the CHID program while writing a dissertation on Nietzsche. Professor Taves holds an undergraduate degree from the University of Manitoba and graduate degrees from Harvard University. In 1984, John was named a MacArthur Prize Fellow winner, and in 1996 became a fellow at the Center for the Advanced Studies in Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University. John currently holds the Alumni Distinguished Professorship in the College of Arts and Sciences. His lecture tonight is titled "Thinking Historically About Thinking Historically, From Identity Politics to Ethical Action." Please join me in welcoming tonight John Taves. John.
Thank you, Mark, for that kind and flattering introduction, and thank you all for coming. I am deeply honored, but also a bit overwhelmed by the task that being honored in this way brings with it. Some of you seemed a bit taken aback when I begged you, a little facetiously perhaps, not to come to this lecture, hoping to limit the witnesses of my public embarrassment, just as President Emmert seemed a bit taken aback when I asked him during the phone call in which he informed me of my selection if this was the kind of thing one could turn down, like a committee assignment, for example. Such comments were obviously lame attempts to be humorous or ironic, but they also revealed a more serious disquietude in some sensitive areas of my psyche, or at least my professional ego. So let me begin by clearing the air and getting a few monkeys off my back. First of all, for me, there is the intrinsic problem of a lecture of this kind. There's something intimidating about presenting a general lecture directed toward a mixed audience composed of professional peers who work with great distinction in a vast and incredibly diverse array of intellectual frameworks and disciplines, to graduate and undergraduate students, to administrators and staff members, and a number of non-academics, mainly my neighbors and friends, who are pretty sick of being talked down to by pretentious professors. The task set for me, as I understand it, is not really to transmit specialized knowledge for those who need to learn about what I already know. As group, professors have a terrible reputation for lecturing to or at people. The verb to lecture has a negative connotation pretty well everywhere in the world outside the circle of the lecturers themselves. In fact, I have tried the term out on a few people outside of academia during the last few weeks and received uniformly negative responses. The term seems to conjure up a kind of abuse to which most people would rather not be subjected. So tonight I would like to speak with you not so much about what I know and you don't, but about the kinds of things that I and others like me actually do at institutions like this. It may perhaps be a bit more personal than a presentation of this kind should be, but will also, I hope, illuminate just a bit the kind of intellectual activities and educational projects that I share with many others here and in other places. The issue for me is compounded by the fact that it is not clear to many people, or sometimes even to myself, how the various activities for which I am being honored, a somewhat esoteric form of historical scholarship and a much more public form of educational innovation, actually cohere or fit together. If you can bear to think along with me as I struggle in front of you to think my way through to clarity about what I do, perhaps we can together gain some insight into why the kinds of things I and my academic associates are doing might be of interest to all of us. So what do I do? In the simplest terms, I think, I write and teach about processes of thinking in the past, about what we might call thinking activity, insofar as its past presence has been deposited in physical traces, primarily in texts, but also in other cultural artifacts, in architecture and design, in painting and in sculpture, in music, and in the performing arts. More particularly, my scholarly interests focus on reconstructing and interpreting these material traces of thinking activity that were produced during the last 2 centuries, primarily in Europe, and even more particularly, that are related to the analysis of a particular question or problem: how and why human beings imagine, represent, and think their earthly existence as an existence in time. So one could say I'm an historical an analyst of what it means to live, or has meant to live, think, and write with the consciousness and responsibility of being historical. The fact that this activity is a discipline, or at least a subdiscipline of scholarship, implies that there is a claim to autonomy for the activity this kind of work addresses, i.e., it is not reducible to expressions of other events, acts, or processes. The history of thinking is premised on a claim or the belief that texts, compositions, buildings, and paintings it studies are not just representations of something more real or basic that goes on elsewhere in people's psyches or in their social, economic, and political relations, but that the material embodiments of thought are actually workplaces and building sites where we can watch or listen to thought in action. Such claims probably require some clarification and a brief discussion of possible misunderstandings. The peculiar professional niche in which I operate academically is variously referred to, in this country at least, as a history of ideas, as cultural history, or as intellectual history. These designations place the emphasis on different elements, and they all have a partial truth to them, but they also are limited in their scope and in their ability to actually pinpoint what intellectual historians do. First of all, it's not really the history of ideas. Mental representations of things, persons, scenes, processes, and events may be building blocks or instruments with which thinking occurs. Thinking is always of something and about something, but what thinking thinks should still be distinguished from the activity of thinking itself. For an intellectual historian, thought is not a passive container of mental objects, but an activity or an agency, directed or oriented toward examining a problem. Second, it's not really the history of culture. Thinking always takes place within a framing structure of cultural meanings, of linguistic rules, of disciplinary codes, but the reconstruction of such frameworks is still different from the acts of thinking and communication that takes place within them that represent one actualization of the possibilities enabled and limited by the framework. A specific sentence, or a text, or a musical composition, or a building, like an action that has actualized one set of possibilities within a framework of possibilities. In distancing itself from its own specific thoughts, making them objects of its own activity, thinking may even make past frameworks of its thinking into objects of thought that can now be inserted into new frameworks. This kind of cultural self-reflection is where intellectual history begins to ask really interesting questions. To what extent can the framework of thinking become an object of reflection? To what extent can thinking encompass thinking about the conditions that make thinking possible in the first place? Third, it's not the history of the intellect or the history of intellectuals. Thinking is a process of reflection that has the capacity to turn not only its corporeal embodiment and social determinations, but also previously actualized choices into objects for itself, to distance itself from them, problematize them, and represent them as a starting point for future acted realities or embodiments. Intellectual history assumes the existence of a reflective capacity in human selves, at least within the evolutionary span of recorded history. It also assumes that certain individuals with reflective capacity have taken it as their vocations to communicate their thinking processes in ways that allow others to listen to them and perhaps recognize themselves in them. Let me note some obvious implications of this conception of intellectual history as a history of thinking. Paraphrase or summary of specific ideas or thoughts can never adequately capture the process of thinking. Thinking is a process of reflection characterized by a freedom of movement that turns all of its specific embodiments into problems for further reflection and further activity. Stopping the action with a snapshot or a summary of contents avoids the essence. Thinking thus always takes the form of narrative in which chronological sequence is absolutely critical. Each act of reflection is shaped by the acts that preceded it. Memory shapes the content of the problem and the expectation for future possibilities. Trying to reconstruct the process of thinking through its various embodiments is illuminated for me by the experience of listening to music. Music engages me, absorbs me as a cultural form that embodies or enacts the performance of reflective activity, the dynamic activity of working through a series of movements between memory and expectation. My own listening self interacts with the subjective agency of the music as it moves through a series of relations that attempt to shape it or give it a specific trajectory. Every event makes the meaning of the previous, changes the meaning of the previous events and the expectations of future events. The listener becomes caught up in this process of self-definition and redefinition, of emancipation from or repetition of the past, in a narrative that only ceases when the music stops. At music's core is the experience of time, or temporality, the constant movement from memory to expectation. Movement dominates the experience, and summary is impossible. To be asked to summarize the movement of thought in a Freudian text is like being asked to summarize the movement of tones in a Mahler symphony. Also, context is crucial for listening. To follow and re-experience the musical subject, we need to grasp the limitations of musical forms in which it operates and that it may be questioning, criticizing, transcending. We need to know the terms that are being used, the inherited genres and forms in which those terms are organized. Listening to thinking and reconstructing its process as an action situated in cultural space and historical time makes possible engagement with that thinking, an engagement that is only possible if the encounter is really an encounter and not just a one-way excavation, projection, or manipulation. Ideas, images, and perceptions can be made into objects of our activity. We can bend, fold, and staple them and fit them into our patterns of thought. But the thinking activity that we may hear in a text is not so easily manipulated, controlled, or bent to our will. To engage with the voice of the other, we need to listen and not just see and possess. So the second monkey, that's what I do. The second monkey is this problem of coherence. Do I have professional multiple identity disorder, I guess is the question. And this brings me back into the realm of the present and the problematic relationship between my scholarly goals about listening to thought, as it is embodied in textual articulations produced in past ages and different cultures, and the construction of an undergraduate educational experience that will help students in this generation, in this time, and in this culture come a few steps closer to understanding their particularity, to experiencing themselves as the objects of their own critical reflection, and to develop both the creative confidence and the humility that will make it possible for them to act responsibly as ethical subjects in the world and find their own way of connecting memory to expectation. And here I would like to refer to the handout, which I hope I also have, which is simply a Xerox from Chid's self-study. It was actually written in 1999 about a statement of educational principles. And if you look at the principles, you'll see how they relate to what I've just been saying. First of all, Chid starts out with a problem and a question, right? That is, the problematization of a certain issue, right, which is the cultural formation of individual and collective identities in different times and places. Secondly, Chid appropriates that awkward neologism, interdisciplinarity, by employing disciplinary methods and perspectives as tools for thinking rather than as ways of defining the problem for thinking. And if you look through numbers 3 to 5, you see that education is imagined as a form of practice. Learning to think is a process of defining yourself in intellectual work that engages the problem and in so doing draws you into dialogue and engagement with others. And finally, in number 6, the 6th principle, critical thinking shapes action in the world by providing self-consciousness of context, by analyzing the conditions within which our actions take place. So I'll return to some of these issues about the way my scholarship relates to my pedagogical conceptions. But I have one final monkey, which is, what is the value of what I do? The implicit question in a request to give a lecture of this kind is, why is what you do important? This is especially relevant in the era of accountability procedures, career self-promotion and competition, and massive fundraising from both the private and the public sectors. Ultimately, the bottom line, why should you be paid to do this? These kinds of questions may be easier to answer for some of you who work in areas in which the relationship between what you do and products that are useful to others is more obvious than it is for scholars and teachers working in the humanities and humanistic social sciences like history. I'm not trying to imply that this is a crass or vulgar question that reduces all value to cash value. Most of us in this room would never formulate the question in that simplistic way, but we would still like to know. Why should we listen? What is the significance, the importance, relevance of this kind of activity for the way we live now and might possibly live in the future? For me, this question has always been especially troubling, not only because since 1984 many people wanted to know what in the world made me worthy of a MacArthur Fellowship, but also because since my late teen years, my father persistently, but without hostility, questioned the ultimate value of some of my academic ambitions and accomplishments with the query, how does this further the work of the Lord? My father was a Mennonite minister and theologian, but I don't want to give the impression that he was a narrow-minded religious fundamentalist who wanted me to peddle Bibles on the street corner. He himself had obtained a PhD in history at a modern research university, the University of Minnesota, during my own formative years in the 60s, and he meant the question in the context, actually, of the kind of academic careerism he himself had encountered within the professional and scholarly world of the post-war era. What he wanted to know was how my work contributed to the common good, enhanced the possibilities for peace, encouraged mutual understanding among strangers, helped individual lives find meaning and purpose, and contributed to the reduction of human violence and the alleviation of human suffering. This lecture, like many of the things I've written and presented in various venues and other occasions, is in part an ongoing conversation with my father's ghost, and an attempt to exorcise that ghost by responding to its nagging questions about the larger value of what I do. Okay, I would like to begin with the problem, as the way I see it, of my work and the one I'd like to discuss in this talk. I've been drawn to investigations of the history of thinking about history especially, in part because of its entanglement in related questions that have concerned me, and I think other members of my historical generation since the beginning of my undergraduate studies. These questions concern the relationship between autonomy and identity on the one hand, and historical self-consciousness on the other. First, human autonomy or self-determination. We may think of this issue most obviously as a political question of self-government, as in the autonomy of states or nations, the psychosocial prerequisites of democratic politics, as in the freedom of the citizen, or the economic independence related to rational action and choice in a market society. But I've been first of all concerned with it as a personal, philosophical, and ethical question, as a question of a particular kind of relationship to oneself and to other selves, in which autonomy can perhaps best be translated as self-authorship, self-fashioning, or self-invention. So the question becomes, what is the role of subjective agency, of personal choice and voluntary action in the formation of individual identity? And secondly, or relatedly, what could possibly function as the ground for such subjective autonomy? Does the physical corporeality of myself and the specific social interactions with other objects and persons enable acts of self-determination as well as limit them? Does the ability of reflective consciousness to step back and critically distance itself from its own corporeality and socially constructed existence apply some kind of metaphysical or religious foundation for human autonomy? The ethical dimension of autonomy is concerned not only with my responsibility to the rules I impose on myself, but also my responsibility in relations to others. How can individual autonomy be reconciled with group membership, collective solidarity, communal association? This cluster of tangled questions about the relationship between self-autonomy and self-identity cannot, in my view, be easily separated from the question of historical self-consciousness. Historical self-consciousness has two obvious dimensions that are intrinsically related to this question. The first dimension, to become historically self-aware, means first of all to grasp one's finite creaturely status, the contingency of individual human existence in space and time, to understand the ways in which the self one lives and all its idiosyncratic complexity is a historical product, to understand the conditions that make us this particular self and define its limits, and thus unveil its illusions, of absolute autonomy or self-sufficiency. Historical understanding teaches or should teach humility. Recognizing one's finite particularity in space and time resists the kind of arrogance that refuses to take account of the conditions that inform and limit particular actions and perspectives. This dimension is what most of us mean most of the time when we say we are teaching students to think historically. A recent article in the newsletter of the American Historical Association defined the tasks of teaching students to think historically in terms of 5 C's, one step up from the 3 R's, I suppose. These were recognition of the significance of change over time and attention to issues of context, causality, contingency, and complexity. All categories of understanding directed toward grasping ourselves and others as specific historical objects or products. Interestingly, the article did not refer to teaching students about action, choice, responsibility, or define the teaching of history as a way to teach the conditions and possibilities of becoming a historical actor. In this view, the article seems to mirror perspectives of our popular culture in common phrases like, she's history, no longer a factor, an agent, that means, right? Or mere history, not pertinent to acting in the present. Or the common identification of historical knowledge with the world of history buffs and antiquarian knowledge and nostalgic escapes into the vanished worlds of the past, which seems to be the notion of history shared by every remodeler who has ever worked in my house. However, we also understand the experience of historical self-awareness, of living our lives as historical beings, as an experience of the freedom to act in history, to make history, to constantly change the conditions of existence through self-initiated actions. Looking backward, we grasp the necessity of the sequence of events and the concatenation of relationships that made us what we are. Nothing in the past can be changed. The past is all about possibilities that have become actualities. Looking forward, however, we can also grasp the opportunities contained in the status of finite historical beings whose existence is contingent and reassembled with each historical act. From this perspective, our particularity and temporal contingency is what makes our freedom possible. Historical understanding of how we become what we are simply gives us a clearer view about how to make reasonable and realistic choices as we project ourselves into the future. So that's the problem: autonomy and identity and their connection to historical self-consciousness. In the last 25 years, I've been involved in 3 general scholarly projects, 3 phases perhaps of the same project. I'm not very good at multitasking, I guess, right? Addressing the relationship between subjective agency or autonomy and historical self-consciousness. During this time, my changing experiences of interaction with the students, staff, and faculty in the CHID program have been difficult to disentangle from my ruminations in the archive, library, and study. All 3 projects could be described as thinking historically about thinking historically. I will briefly describe the first 2 projects completed in early 80s and more recently at the beginning of this century, and then focus on my current project, which is still very much unfinished and underway. The first project was organized around the problem of coming to terms with a collapse of belief in a single, coherent, purposive narrative in history, a pattern of liberation and human self-actualization that gave meaning to all individual narratives. This first project emerged from my, and I like to think my historical generation's, experience of the cultural revolution of the late 60s and the disillusionment that followed. My official career as a historical scholar began in the fall of 1968 when I put together the prospectus for my doctoral dissertation. At its inception, the project was a search for historical parallels, for comrades in arms among the dead. I was looking for sympathetic subjects that would help me think through a certain pattern of generational identification. As was true of many individuals of my social class and generation who had grown up in the post-1945 era, I operated with an inherited set of assumptions, a public script, we might say, that framed the ways we told particular stories about the past. This intellectual inheritance was a progressive unitary narrative that emphasized both the process of liberation from forms of repression and exclusion and the construction of increasingly inclusive forms of human community that affirmed the self-determination of the liberated. Although as a Canadian, I was taught to read my own life into the script in terms of the categories of British tradition and institutions conquering the world through the Commonwealth of Nations, rather than in terms of a global movement toward liberal self-government and economic modernization led by American power, the general idea was the same. One's own life gained historical meaning when one could insert it into this larger, local, national, global story of liberation and integration. Like so many others of my generation, the turmoil of the 60s led me to believe that this inherited framing narrative had defined liberation in much too narrow a fashion, especially regarding the opportunities for individual self-expression in its more physical or sensual forms, and was far too exclusive in its pattern of integration, that is, too male, too white, too Euro-American. My first attempts to think historically about the past were aimed at expanding this original script, and thus contributing to a public memory that would support a more inclusive narrative for liberation and integration. My dissertation eventually bore what now seems to me a rather quaint and embarrassing title called The Innocence of the Self: Cultural Disinheritance and Cultural Liberation in the Thought and Experience of the Young Germans and the Young Hegelians. The study was an historical investigation of groups of radical intellectuals in early 19th century Germany who, for a brief historical moment, lived in the utopian consciousness that the stories of their personal lives and the stories of their cultural communities were fused into one story at an epochal historical juncture, a redemptive, transformative, revolutionary moment in which the actualization of everyone's full human potential would emerge as a principle of a new kind of human community. In my particular case, this attempt to expand public memory was tied to my personal narrative of emancipation from the specific conceptions of liberation and integration nourished in a small, exclusive religious community. So I thought out that particular historical moment when sacred narratives of redemption contained in religious traditions were translated into secular narratives of historical humanism. In my case, as in many others as well, this kind of historical hope dissipated before the projects were actually completed, but by the time the dissertation became a book, it had been transformed into an investigation of the collapse of redemptive belief in sustaining teleological narratives, not just sacred ones, but also and especially the secularized narratives of historical humanism. The dashed hopes of my generation led me and others to a problematization of the relationship between autonomy, identity, and historical consciousness. First of all, the status, not just the content, but the status of the framing narratives of collective liberation and integration needed to be critically re-examined, not just for flaws of inclusion and exclusion, but in terms of the justifications for their general validity as overarching and universal. After the disillusionment, liberation and integration needed to be defined more as a specific and defined historical task, not a recognition of larger patterns of development in which one could insert one's individual life, something that had to be produced rather than something that could be found. But what were the conditions of such action? How could one affirm one's freedom and power to act in history and join with others in collective endeavors to create the conditions for freedom and community? What limitations needed to be placed on freedom and self-determination and self-expression in order to organize the will to collective action? This new questioning of the relationship between autonomy and identity became the starting point for a new way of thinking about the past and historical self-consciousness in the past. But certain residues remained embedded in my future projects. And before I move on, I'd just like to mention two of these. I think historical self-consciousness is always self-critique, a critical examination of the real conditions and possibilities of historical change. A central problem of historical self-consciousness is to grasp the specific limitations and thus also the real possibilities for choice embedded in a specific historical moment. Historical hopes are doomed to be dashed unless they are supported by a serious and disabused appraisal of the limitations and possibilities for historical action. The historian should not be a teller of comforting and edifying tales, but a critic of baseless hopes and simplifying nostalgia. Truth-telling, in the sense of making us face what doesn't fit and conform to our most intensely held desires, is part of the ethos of being an historian. My favorite song, as you might guess, of the 1970s was Leonard Cohen's "There Are No Chocolates in the Boxes Anymore." The second lesson that I kept from this period is that historical meaning and value is not something we discover, but something that we find. Now, this second lesson led directly into what I would call my second project. In the 1980s, I continued to think through what it meant to be historically self-aware in the wake of the collapse of convincing secular narratives of collective transformation, but my studies turned more and more to an investigation of historical difference and historical discontinuity, and to the historical self-consciousness as a consciousness of responsibility for the construction of individual and collective identities. My investigations in this case focused on a group of thinkers, again in early 19th century Germany, who participated in a public project to both define and actively bring into reality an integration of autonomy and community through the voluntary subjective identification of individuals with a shared past or collective memory. The problem that organized the thinking of this group was the transition from what they called ethnic identity to ethical identification, without the guarantee of imminent historical necessity. So basically the movement from the notion that communities are shaped and given in tradition, right, and the notion that tradition has collapsed into a society of anarchic individual egos and that community can only be recreated through the ethical task of people actually consciously identifying with each other as having had similar, as being drawn together by experiences which they shared. The task that they set themselves was to think through the possibility that ethical community could be the product of specific action, a historical construction rather than a historical expression. To recognize oneself as historical was to recognize that both personal and collective identities were produced in the historical process itself. As I listened and thought along with this process of thinking, I found myself struggling to clarify my own status as a historical subject. And it was during this time that I wrote a whole bunch of articles generally about the theory of historical self-consciousness. And these are some of the lessons that I brought from that. One, a critical demystification of the universal given nature of the present is a product of the recognition of historical difference. Becoming historically self-conscious means to become conscious that your present existence is separated from the past by a thick line dividing two forms of life. It reveals the way we live now as not natural, or universal, as not just the way things are, according to common sense, but limited, particular, a way of being that's not necessary but contingent, that could have been otherwise. The beginning of historical wisdom is to grasp the present as exotic, foreign, strange, to be amazed by the wonder of the familiar. Historical consciousness, as a consciousness of living within history, arises with an experience of shock and wonder at the difference that marks where you are now from where you or your generation or your cultural community were before. It means to look at a document and realize that it could not have been produced here and now, but that it speaks from the other side of a temporal boundary. And that in order to understand it, we need to reconstruct the language and context in which it originally made sense and communicated itself so effortlessly. To be historically conscious is to perceive the objects, texts, artifacts, the material remains left to us by the past as opaque and enigmatic, as presences that indicate the existence of other worlds ordered by different rules from the one we now inhabit, in which we find these materials scattered like the remains of an alien visitation. For those material remains to make sense, we have to conjure up the world in which they were created. The second lesson that I drew from this was that the recognition of different leads to a complete collapse of the notion of natural or essential identities. who we are as members of various groups and associations, and how we define our individual identities in relationship to these associations is a historical cultural production or construction, not an expression of some purposive or meaning-providing power that exists outside of the particular finite meetings that individual human beings in specific places and times have created for their lives. The networks of cultural meaning in which we define our physical embodiment and our relationship to others in the world are themselves contingent and limited in space and time. But some problems started to rise as I started to think through this. The recognition of such radical historical difference also produces, in fact, a new form of cultural determinism. If identities are produced in particular cultural times and temporal systems in a multitude of different worlds, and these worlds are not tied together in a larger metaphysical or natural order, or in an order of teleological unfolding, then the difference between these worlds may still be seen as rigidly bounded in their very incommensurability. Within those different worlds, identities are inevitably determined. All events are contingent, but no actions are free. Freedom only exists somehow in the interstices between the past and the present, between the self and the other. Now, the focus on difference and incommensurability, I think, had positive and liberating dimensions. It undermined the universalizing tendency of powerful groups that try to read their particular meanings and realities onto less powerful others, and thus oppose a kind of false universality. It recognized the autonomy and dignity of those whose cells were formed in different worlds. It could reanimate the dead as subjects making themselves, or at least produced within the terms of, their own worlds. It authorized cultural pluralism and defined a politics of multiculturalism or cultural diversity. The problem with this position was that it could be seen as reinstituting an identity politics with some of the same problems as the segregating conceptions of natural determinism or transcendent fiat. It could be practiced in ways that were as segmenting and as deterministic as the biologically based politics of race or gender difference, or the religious politics of the saved and the damned. A rather different kind of problem was that this focus on historical difference tended to disintegrate as soon as it was pursued without the foundation of natural or metaphysical beliefs. Once boundaries were, in fact, no longer sustained by metaphysical or natural differences, they were really difficult to sustain. Networks of cultural meaning interacted and overlapped. In practice, the cultural world of the past appeared as heterogeneous and fluid compounds, open to constant interactions and exchanges with similarly fluid and heterogeneous systems or worlds, producing endless individual hybrids rather than homogeneous identities, and a set of open-ended and proliferating relationships constantly changing through each individual act of historical contact, of merger or exchange, rather than a pluralistic world of rigid or even easily recognizable group differences. The consciousness of radical historical difference, moreover, led to a second tangle of difficulties. Recognition of the incommensurable pluralism of cultural worlds could lead to the experience of an in-between that was without cultural determination at all. If the historical cultural worlds in which our I's and we's were fashioned were both contingent and incommensurable, if they could be imagined as totally other, a window was opened into the abyss of radical, total freedom, a kind of undefined nothing, a pure potential from which we could almost arbitrarily create worlds of our own choosing. The radical historicism of multiculturalism was thus torn between two reductive possibilities: a deceptive return to historical determinism, now defined as contingent cultural construction on the one hand, and a kind of transcendent freedom, unaffected by the realities of temporally and spatially situated existence. Both positions evaded the tensions and responsibility of historical existence. In my own historical studies, I followed the process of thinking that moved from this experience of radical freedom produced by the experience of cultural pluralism and contingency to the search for anchors for personal identity in some pre-cultural natural state or transcendent reality. So my investigations left me with a new kind of problem. What were the possibilities for creating ethical relations among historical individuals without calling on belief in a transcendent power that operated outside of the construction of historical differences? Now, this phase in my own scholarly thinking was tied to important developments in the philosophy of the CHID program, and we interacted with it in ways that I probably can't really fully define. Most obviously was the focus on displacement, on our attempt to bring students to a consciousness that the worlds in which they were born and socialized were contingent, and that their views of the world were specific, not universal, that they needed to learn to recognize the otherness of others, and of the cultural worlds in which other identities were formed. The goal of historical consciousness was not to become masters of the universe, but humble citizens in a globe and nation defined by cultural pluralism. Our introductory course, The Question of Human Nature, was sometimes called by Jim Klaus, our associate director, freshman disorientation. It was meant to make students uncomfortable in their own skins, to induce a case of cultural vertigo. The second element, which is closely tied to the pedagogy of the CHID program, was this emphasis on freedom and creativity, which we tried to nurture in what we really tried to do was nurture the newfound sense of freedom and possibility that students would get from cultural vertigo, right? And now this has taken a number of forms, many of which are still installed in the program. A strong emphasis on individualized senior research projects, which encourage creativity rather than conformity in methods and aims, following one's passion, right? Not the inherited disciplinary direction, right, which was given to you. But also, and perhaps with more originality and daring, on initiatives aimed at encouraging the participation of students and staff in the creation of curricular content and curricular context in their education. That is, in actually producing the syllabi for the major classes and also producing the structure of the way in which those classes were taught. Now, some of this may now seem a little schematic and simplistic, but from these practices, there emerged investigations, proliferating collaborations and different kinds of investigations which focused on new kinds of priorities and new ways of thinking the relationship between autonomy and identity on the one hand and historical context on the other. First of all, there was a new movement toward interdisciplinary collaborations about the natural determinants of processes of cultural identity formation, new ways of understanding the body and its processes that appeared with new developments in biogenetics and neuroscience. How do these developments change the way in which we understand processes of self-representation and social interaction, not to speak of self-reflection and the process of thinking itself? There was a development of a new interest in religion as a kind of post-confessional spirituality connected to the experience of radical freedom from cultural determinants and the apparent responsibilities of self-invention. Not religious belief as the foundation for establishing cultural boundaries, but as an anchor for the freedom of self-making that emerged from experiences of radical freedom beyond cultural identity. Third, there was an increased focus on communication across difference, on conflict resolution, dialogue and reconciliation, on the overcoming of differences, or on bridging across differences would be a better way of putting it. This did not mean ignoring the reality of boundaries, but building bridges. And I have to mention here, again, our tragically deceased associate director, James Klaus, who made it his real passion, right, to develop the process or the set of associations connected with dialogue, conflict resolution, forgiveness, reconciliation, and so on. Now, these activities produced, in turn, a new focus on various ways in which individual self-formation emerges as a complex process of interaction with significant others who enrich our conceptions of who we are and who we might become. That affirm difference is not just the boundary that divides us, but as an opportunity that opens up complex historical possibilities for each individual self. But for me, what was really important was that what this led to in the program was a really strong attempt to reach out within the university to include the experiences of students and faculty and staff who were members of ethnic minorities, sexual minorities, and so on, so that we had this whole sort of proliferation of classes recently that from the diversity class taught by Jeanette Bushnell to hip-hop classes taught by Georgia Roberts, and to our current attempt to integrate students from the athletic departments into our foreign study programs. And I have to say that in terms of my own personal growth, this process has been incredibly interesting and educational for me. That is, in terms of this huge expansion of the sets of relationships in which I am daily situated, and the growing recognition about the kinds of possibilities that are available in the construction of people's individual identities. Now, this all came together in a growing interest in the complex processes of embodied and individualized identity formation, on the ability of concrete individual selves to distance themselves from fixed or stable identities of gender, sexuality, ethnicity, or religion, and engage in a constant process of reinvention. This new central theme led to the problem of what I called the emancipation from identity. Now, why is the emancipation from identity a problem? It's not just totally exhilarating. Why does the focus on individual construction of our own selves, our responsibility to create a recognizably differentiated selves for ourselves and others, often seem so depressing? Why does the world of special individuals reveling in their specialness, in their ability to invent and constantly reinvent themselves, often seem so monochromatic and so flat, so boring? Why does the self that strongly affirms the belief that it is the creator or inventor of itself often seem to emerge together with a profound sense of emptiness, isolation, and loneliness? This problematization was articulated as one, the question of intersubjective relations, collaborations, and ethical commitments that involve the subordination of the individual self to causes aimed at the common good. And two, the need for a home, a community that might sustain and also enrich the endless process of self-invention. On what basis do self-authorizing individuals relate to each other, trust each other, work together to change their circumstances and their environment? Now, this is tied into phase 3, which I don't think I'll have time to talk about at any length in my project, which is my current research on Freud and the problem of individual identity formation and its relationship to collaboration and community. It's strange, I think, a little bit, that this question, the question of the emancipation from identity and the creation of individualized identity formation led me back to Freud. Well, maybe not so strange in one sense, but strange in the sense that I was trying to consider this problem in terms of how one moves from the emancipation of identity to problems of social interaction, forms of community and collaboration, and so on. Most of us, I think, would see Freud as the theorist of individual identity formation and not a particularly obvious choice in trying to think through the dilemmas that arise from that belief that we are all authors of ourselves and move toward the ways of thinking about community that go beyond forms of identity politics. Now, as I can see, I don't really have time to talk about this segment of my research, but what I tried to do was to follow Freud as he thought the question of autonomy from his late teenage years through into his maturity, and how he moved from a question of self-autonomy, which was tied to our participation in the universal activity of self-reflection, rational activity of self-reflection, to a problem of autonomy, which was an autonomy that emerged as a self-authorization which grew out of our actual particular production of individuality through the entry into the world of culture. That is, the way in which our individual being was in fact the site and the place for the process of self-reflection, self-making, self-creation. Now, in this process, identity itself emerged for Freud as a self-imposed limitation on human agency. The goal of attaining the universal norm of the self-determining subject was replaced by the goal of maintaining critical self-consciousness or reflective distance from the constant tendency to fixate the flow of human subjectivity in terms of specific identities. Self-conscious knowledge of the constructed nature of identity produced a new conception of individual autonomy as the constant transcendence of all identities in an interminable process of self-analysis and self-critique. This performance of identity or individual autonomy beyond identity remained for Freud a particular privilege of some individuals, particularly male individuals and male middle-class individuals. However, this was not an essential limitation, but a historical one. It expressed Freud's belief in the intractable limitations of reality and the collective imposition of certain identities on certain bodies because of inequalities of function and power in the processes of reproduction and production. But thinking along with Freud in terms of the problem of thinking historically was interesting for me because, first of all, Freud's thought exemplified the two major dimensions of being historical. His analytic or diagnostic moment investigated the meanings that the selves consciously create within the determinants of physical embodiment and historical structures, and thus what it meant to know ourselves as individually constituted in historical time and place. His therapeutic goal thinks through the ideal of what it means to be historical as a conscious individual actor who recognizes and can reflect on his or her apparent natural and historical determinations as a process of unconscious self-making within a certain structure of limitation and possibility. Freud thinks this moment of recognition as an assertion of freedom that finally stops the process of unconscious determination of the future and allows us to clarify our choices and determine our actions. Autonomy is conceived here as a freedom to fashion ourselves within the natural and cultural limitations of reality. It's not self-sufficiency. It is part of the recognition of our individual historical particularity. In fact, we must renounce the primal desires for self-sufficiency and resist imagining autonomy as a self-making outside of the conditions of our creaturely finitude. That, in Freud's view, can only lead to pathologies which he so brilliantly chronicled, like paranoia, megalomania, narcissism, melancholia, and so on. The problem this view represented, as Freud's first disciples already noted and many later followers recognized, was to how to move from what we might call the morality of individual self-ownership and responsibility to mutual recognition among self-owners and an ethic of solidarity. So how do we think this transition from from the emancipation from identity politics, in which Freud was a great proponent, to ethical relationships between selves and others? Now, as we know, Freud didn't say that much about this. He had one view, which was sort of the John Stuart Mill view, right? Was the notion that once we clear ourselves of our unconscious desire to read our identities into others, we are free then to deal with the problem of differences in wealth, power, social status, and so on, in pragmatic, rational ways. So that individual self-makers, once they cease to desire universal fixed identities, can in fact engage in setting up traffic rules which will allow them to all produce their individual self-making in ways which don't impinge on the individual self-making of others, which is sort of what On Liberty is all about. Freud was a great reader and also fan of John Stuart Mill. But Freud also recognized that all of our individual projects of self-authorship are interconnected. We don't connect with others because we share some essential ground, natural or essential ground, but that overcomes the boundaries of our historical differences, but through the very activities in which we construct our different historical individual selves. Within this network of non-identical but related processes of individual narrative construction, we come to recognize in each other, first of all, a general human struggle for autonomous individual self-making, but also specific parallels, analogies, and similarities that reach across the individualized projects. Such interactions expand and enrich the possibilities of historical choice for ourselves and for others. This is poorly formulated and not very clearly defined in Freud, but it is central to Chid's educational experiment and its future development. And I would like to conclude this by referring again to the handout, if I can find it again, especially to the picture at the bottom of the back page, which is a picture of the Chid logo, right, the rhizome. First of all, it's a horizontal network rather than a vertical hierarchy. It's composed of proliferating connections without clear boundaries dividing the inside and the outside. It has no single center, but multiple centers, like nodes that coalesce for periods of time and then dissolve and form new roots and tubers with new nodes from which spring new problems that create new extensions of the network and change the horizons for every participant. The rhizome network allows for coalitions for specific purposes and around specific questions, but it resists permanent formations that force individuals into a stable straitjacket of the we. It envisions an association in which there are no leaders invested with authority, but only facilitators. One would think, since these conjunctures, these associations and collaborations are so ephemeral and unstable, that their imprint on individual stories, their ability to inspire loyalty to the whole network must be very weak. That the sense of engagement, the boundaries between insiders and outsiders must be incredibly porous and shifting. Shouldn't this form of a horizontal, proliferating, constantly reinvented network of associations lead to a deficit in trust, loyalty, sustained responsibility, and stability? Can you really count on those nomadic individuals that your caravan encounters in its temporary stays at various Oasis conference hotels? Can the rhizome function as a community, as a home? To my amazement and wonder, CHID's messy, rhizomatic proliferation of projects and collaborations has produced the closest thing to a community of learning and scholarship, an academic home, that I have experienced since I entered academic life in 1973. And it's not just me. As we know, there are recognizable CHID individuals, and some would even say, students complain that there is a CHID culture. There are CHIDies who identify themselves with this rhizome and return to it, sometimes years later, as if they were coming home. How can this be? Why should a sense of community and loyalty to a common endeavor emerge from this kind of fluid, constantly proliferating and self-transforming rhizomatic network? I can't really tell you. I have some preliminary hypotheses about autonomy, intensity of commitment and collaboration, however limited and short, the experience of self-growth within diversity. That experience of self-growth within diversity trumps homogeneity and authority in the creation of trust and loyalty and so on. But surely this experiential reality must become a dimension for our thinking, again, of our past in relationship to our future possibilities. That it has created a new problematic, shall we say, for thinking historically, about how the emancipation from identity recreates and perhaps even enhances the possibility for ethical commitment, reciprocal attachments, collective action. And that's just where I'll leave it.